The heart monitor was still ticking when my son leaned toward the doctor and said, "She's not dying fast enough." Still, I sat there as his mother, hands steady, staring at the screen that had once watched me labor to bring him into this world. As the ticking echoed, I realized it sounded just like the nights I stayed awake listening to him breathe as a child. While the doctor's face tightened, that same sound stitched together who I raised and who he chose to become. The same heartbeat he was measuring for an ending reminded me I was the beginning he no longer respected. That's when I decided I wouldn't give my son a death to profit from, I'd give him a life he no longer controls. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Helen sat still, her back straight against the hard plastic of the examination chair, feeling the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Benton's voice was steady, offering the same diagnosis for the third time that morning: chronic pulmonary fibrosis. The words slipped into the air like a slow-moving fog, thick and dense with finality. Her lungs would weaken, but not immediately. Not fast enough to make her feel the panic that death often brings, but slow enough to remind her every morning that it was coming. His voice softened. "There are medications, Helen, treatments that can help slow the progression, but it's about managing your symptoms now, not curing them. You'll need to be careful. No stress, no strain. We'll need to keep an eye on this." Helen nodded, though it felt like the gesture was as much for herself as it was for him. She felt the weight of the diagnosis, but also the strange comfort that it wasn't immediate. A slow, creeping kind of goodbye, the kind you could almost ignore if you weren't careful. She could do this. She would do this. But then Evan's voice interrupted her thoughts, sharp and dismissive. "We should start estate planning soon." Helen blinked, disoriented for a moment. She turned slowly toward him. Evan stood in the doorway of the small exam room, his arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Claire hovered behind him, looking almost like a shadow, her presence as quiet and passive as always. Helen's pulse quickened, but she didn't speak. She didn't have to. She could already feel the undertone of urgency in his words. He wasn't worried about her diagnosis. He was worried about what it meant for him: the inheritance, the house, the cabin. It was all slipping away with the knowledge that she was still alive, still fighting, still here. She watched him with a stillness that surprised her, even as his gaze softened with what could have been considered concern. But she didn't miss the slight edge to his words, the impatience buried beneath his calm exterior. Dr. Benton cleared his throat, offering a measured glance at Evan, then back at Helen. "Helen, you heard me. The prognosis, it's a slow progression. No need for drastic changes just yet." But Evan's voice cut through again, this time sharper. "You're not dying fast enough." The words hung in the air, thick with something Helen couldn't quite name. Frustration? Disappointment? Something darker, deeper. She didn't even blink at first, as if he hadn't just opened his mouth to release something that could never be taken back. Dr. Benton's gaze flickered to Helen, then back at Evan, his expression a mix of disbelief and restrained disapproval. "I hope you didn't mean that." Helen didn't react, not at first. The drive home was long. A silence that felt like a weight, thick and suffocating, filling the car in a way the air outside never could. Evan didn't speak, didn't try to break the silence. Claire, as always, remained quiet, her eyes distant as she stared out the passenger side window. Helen didn't glance at either of them. Instead, she watched the trees flash by, the green blur a dull comfort. The silence settled between them like a fog pressing in on her chest, but she didn't speak. What could she say? What was there left to say? She could still feel Evan's words, the coldness of them reverberating in her ears. "You're not dying fast enough." The sentence, he would never take it back, and neither would she. That line had been drawn, and there was no erasing it. As they turned into the driveway, she could hear the faint hum of the engine winding down. The car stopped, but Helen didn't wait for him to open the door. She stepped out of the car without a word, her feet moving slowly toward the front steps of the house. She didn't glance back. The door closed softly behind her, but she could still feel the weight of that conversation settling in the space around her. The house was quiet, just as she liked it. And for the first time in years, it felt like she was finally standing in the center of her life. Not Evan's, not anyone else's. She was still here, and Evan would have to reckon with that. Helen heard the knock on the door but didn't move. The sound was insistent, almost demanding, but she stayed seated in her favorite armchair, the one her husband had bought at a yard sale 20 years ago. The sun was pouring in through the front window, casting long shadows across the room, and for a moment she allowed herself to just be there. In the stillness, she knew who it was before the knock had even faded away. Evan had arrived as expected with a notary. Just to get ahead of things, she imagined him saying in his clipped, efficient tone. The sound of his voice, the controlled urgency, echoed in her mind. She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the phone and dialed Ruth's number. The line clicked, then Ruth's voice came through, warm and familiar. "Helen, you okay?" Helen stood up, walking slowly to the kitchen. "How about lunch? I've got some leftover soup." Ruth's voice softened, a knowing pause before she replied, "I'll be over in 15. The knock on the door came again, more persistent this time, and Helen's fingers tightened around the phone. She set it down and went to the window. There, in the driveway, stood Evan and the notary, both of them casting impatient glances toward the front door, waiting for something they had no right to wait for. Helen smiled faintly to herself, shaking her head. No, today was not the day for this. The lunch that followed was quiet, the way it always was when Ruth came over. The two of them sat at the small wooden table, the afternoon sunlight glinting off the edge of the table. Helen dipped her spoon into the soup, the warmth of it almost grounding her. Ruth pushed her bowl aside after a few sips, her eyes never leaving Helen's face. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. "What's going on, Helen?" Helen let out a slow breath, letting the tension in her chest dissipate. She took her time answering, then looked up, her gaze steady. "He's waiting for me to go. He's been waiting since the diagnosis, I think, for the end to come faster." Ruth's expression hardened. She didn't need to ask for details. She had known Evan for years, seen the shifts in him, his impatience, his cold pragmatism. Ruth's jaw clenched, but she didn't speak right away. "I won't give him that," Helen continued, her voice quiet but firm. "Not yet, and certainly not on his terms." Ruth reached across the table and placed her hand over Helen's. "You don't have to, Helen, not for him." Helen smiled, a thin, bittersweet smile. "I know." The next morning, Helen drove to the county clerk's office, the engine of the old car humming steadily beneath her. The trip was short, but the weight of the decision she was about to make felt heavier with each mile. The familiar roads of Asheville, the winding streets that had been part of her life for so long, now felt distant, disconnected. She arrived and stepped into the office, the cool air of the building a stark contrast to the warmth outside. It was quiet, no other visitors, just the sound of a distant phone ringing. She approached the counter, her steps echoing in the empty space, and the clerk, a woman with tired eyes, looked up. Helen's voice was steady when she spoke. "I need to make some changes to my property deed. I want it placed into a living trust with no successor named." The clerk's brow furrowed slightly. "You're sure about that?" Helen met her gaze, unblinking. "I'm sure." By late afternoon, the deed had been changed. The paperwork was signed. As Helen walked out of the office, she felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders, but it was a weight she had chosen for herself. The house, the cabin, none of it would pass easily to Evan. Not unless he changed his ways, and she wasn't about to give him that chance. She was halfway home when her phone buzzed in her purse. It was a text from Claire. "You should rest, you're acting emotionally." Helen stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting the message without replying. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. She wasn't acting emotionally, she was acting with clarity finally. As she pulled into the driveway, the weight of the decision she had just made didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. She walked inside, the house feeling suddenly more hers than it had in years. Evan would come looking for what he thought was his, but Helen had already begun to take it all back. Helen sat alone in the sterile waiting room, her fingers lightly tapping on the cold plastic armrest. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the sound filling the quiet space as she glanced at the other patients around her, none of them looking up, none of them waiting for the same kind of answer she was. It was her third time sitting here in the past few weeks, but today felt different. The stillness was heavier, the anticipation thick in the air. Her mind kept drifting back to Evan's words, "You're not dying fast enough." She hadn't spoken to him since then, hadn't let him see her pain. No, not this time. This time she was in charge of the narrative. The door to the back office opened and Dr. Benton emerged. His face was calm, but there was a shift in his posture as his eyes met hers. There was a kind of understanding between them now, a shared recognition of the gravity of the situation. "Ms. Moore," he said, his voice low but steady, "we're all set for your appointment." Helen nodded and stood, her back straight, her steps purposeful. She followed him into the exam room, the familiar scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. The door clicked shut behind her. Dr. Benton led her to the same chair she had sat in countless times before. He checked the notes on his clipboard, then looked up at her, his expression open but cautious. "I know why you're here, Helen," he said quietly, "and I respect your decision to take control of your health." She met his gaze, unwavering. "You heard what he said. Would you trust him with my care?" Dr. Benton didn't flinch. His brow furrowed slightly as he set down his pen, placing both hands flat on the desk in front of him. He exhaled slowly, the silence stretching out for a moment before he finally spoke. "I'd document everything," he said, his voice resolute. "And I'd make sure there's a record of it. It's not just your health that matters here, it's your peace of mind." Helen absorbed his words, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. It wasn't just about the disease anymore. It was about the erosion of her trust. Evan's cold disregard had cut deeper than any diagnosis ever could. "I'm revoking his access to my medical records," she said, her voice firm, "effective immediately." Dr. Benton didn't hesitate. He took out a form and slid it across the desk to her. She signed it quickly, her signature neat and practiced. As she passed it back to him, he nodded, acknowledging her decision. "I'll make sure everything is in order," he said, sliding the paperwork into his file, "and I'll assign a patient advocate to you just in case." Helen's heart didn't race, it was steady, unshaken. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't waiting for anyone to give her permission to live. Before she could leave, Dr. Benton glanced at her with a rare moment of vulnerability. "Helen, I want you to know that you're not alone in this." She didn't respond immediately, but her eyes softened. There was something about his presence that made the world feel a little less heavy, a little less daunting. Later that afternoon, Helen's phone buzzed as she was sorting through some papers at the kitchen table. It was a text from Claire, terse and direct. "I called the office. Why did you revoke his access?" Helen didn't flinch at the question. She wasn't surprised. She knew Evan's influence extended everywhere. But she was done with the secrets, done with pretending things were fine when they were anything but. She typed her response slowly with careful precision. "Because I don't trust him, and because this is my decision to make." Just as she hit send, the phone rang. It was Claire. Helen didn't pick up. The hours stretched on, but for the first time in weeks, Helen felt a sense of control that had long eluded her. The quiet of the house, the peaceful hum of the evening outside reminded her that she was still here, still in charge. She didn't need Evan's approval. She didn't need Claire's judgment. This time, it was all up to her. The sound of a knock at the door later that evening made her freeze. It was quiet at first, almost tentative, but then it grew more insistent. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She wasn't sure who it was, but she already knew what they'd want. And for the first time, she wasn't ready to let anyone in. Helen knelt in the cool dirt of her garden, her hands steady as she worked the trowel into the earth. The air was still, the scent of damp soil and the soft hum of insects filling the space around her. She had always loved the garden, but now, in the quiet after the storm of the past few weeks, it felt like the only place she could find any peace. Each breath she took was deliberate, each movement slow and careful, as if she was rediscovering the rhythm of her own life, step by step. She had no particular plan, no grand design for the day, only the task before her, restoring what had been neglected. Over the years, the garden had grown wild, just like the house, just like her life had been, tangled in things she hadn't quite tended to. Now she was pulling out roots, digging up what had overrun the place, preparing to start fresh. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard as she moved from one patch of earth to the next. She dug deeper, pulling stubborn roots from the ground. Audrey appeared beside her, the sound of her boots crunching against the gravel. The 15-year-old dropped to her knees beside her grandmother, grabbing a spade with a determined frown. "It's like they don't want to leave," Audrey said, tugging at a particularly gnarly root. She grinned, revealing a streak of dirt across her cheek, her hands already grimy from the work. Helen smiled faintly. They don't, but they'll have to. She passed her granddaughter a fresh patch of soil to work on, and Audrey dove in with a surprising amount of energy, digging with the kind of focus only a teenager could muster. The work was quiet, meditative. But as the afternoon wore on, the peaceful rhythm of it felt like a conversation, an unspoken exchange between the two of them, their hands moving in tandem. Helen could feel the tension of the last few days slowly unwinding, the weight of her decisions slowly lifting with each weed she pulled, each plant she coaxed back into the soil. It was hours later when Ruth arrived, carrying a bag of fresh soil and a bottle of wine tucked under one arm. She set them down gently on the porch and walked toward Helen, her smile warm but knowing. Ruth had always understood without needing to be told. "You've been at it for hours, haven't you?" Ruth asked, her voice soft but amused. She handed Helen the wine. "Thought you could use a little something to keep you going." Helen took the bottle and uncorked it with practiced ease. The deep red liquid swirled into glasses they had used 100 times before, the clink of the glass like a small victory, a toast to the small victories she was beginning to claim for herself. Audrey took a glass too with a quiet nod, then set it down beside her as she continued her work. "What's next?" she asked, digging deeper into the ground. Helen didn't respond right away. Instead, she sipped her wine and watched her granddaughter, her heart full of something she couldn't name. She wasn't ready to say it out loud, but the truth had been with her all along. "You know," she said softly, her voice far away, "your grandfather was the real love of my life." Audrey paused for a moment, looking up at her grandmother with curiosity in her eyes. Helen's voice softened further as she told stories about her late husband, stories of their first house, their adventures, how they had worked side by side in the garden just as they were now, how they had spent their lives tending not just to their home but to each other. Helen's hands stilled for a moment, remembering the love they had built over the years, the quiet joy of working together day by day. She let the memory linger before taking another sip of her wine. The quiet was broken by the sound of a car rolling slowly down the street. Helen didn't glance up at first, but when she did, she saw the familiar car, Evan, driving past. He was looking at them, watching from behind the wheel, his face unreadable as he passed. Helen didn't wave, she didn't even blink. She just watched him go, the tires crunching over the gravel, the dust rising in the rearview mirror as the car disappeared down the street. She turned back to the garden, taking another deep breath, the weight of his presence already fading. The garden was hers, the house was hers, and Evan, well, he had made his choices. And so had she. The low hum of the city faded as Helen stepped into the cool, quiet office of the trust attorney. The walls were lined with bookshelves that held heavy volumes on legal precedents, and the air smelled faintly of paper and something older, wisdom maybe, or just the weight of time. Helen was used to it, this sense of formality, of structure, of order in a world that had recently felt like it was tilting too far toward chaos. The attorney, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a practiced smile, greeted her with a handshake. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, settling in a plush chair across from his polished desk. "So Helen, I've reviewed your wishes," the attorney said, flipping through a set of documents in front of him. "You're looking to transfer ownership of the family cabin into a wildlife trust with yourself as the lifelong caretaker. And then there's the matter of the clause you'd like to add. No inheritance to any individual showing willful cruelty. I assume that S aimed at your son." Helen's fingers curled around the armrests, her knuckles pale. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, though the words tasted like vinegar in her mouth. "That's exactly what I want." The attorney gave her a measured look. "I'll make sure that clause is watertight. It's unusual, but it can be done. It's your decision, after all." Helen didn't smile. She didn't feel the need to. Her life had been ruled by expectations and obligations for so long, by a son who thought her worth only what he could inherit. No more, not anymore. She was done waiting for him to see her as anything other than an asset. The documents were finalized quickly. There was little emotion in it, not from the attorney, not from her, but as she signed her name neatly, purposefully, she could feel the shift deep inside her. She was taking control, taking it all back. Back home, Helen sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in front of her. The cabin, the one that had been her refuge, her sanctuary, was now safely in the trust. It wasn't just land, it was a symbol. a symbol of what she had endured and what she would no longer allow. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from Claire. "Evan's just stressed, he didn't mean it." Helen stared at the screen for a long time before replying. The words were cold, precise, and final. "He meant it, that's the only honest thing he said in years." The words felt final, like the snapping of a twig beneath the weight of something heavy. She wasn't angry anymore. There was no point in anger. She had simply seen him for who he was, a man more concerned with what he could gain than who his mother was. That was his truth, and she had seen it clearly. She set the phone down, not waiting for a response. She didn't need it. There was nothing more to say. Helen stood, crossing to the window, her gaze lingering on the distant mountains, the peaks shrouded in mist as though they were hiding something just out of reach. The cabin, now untouchable to Evan, sat in those mountains, silent but waiting. The place that had once been a dream, a sanctuary of sorts, would now belong to no one except her. The quiet outside was broken only by the faint rustle of leaves, and in that stillness Helen allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She was free not just of the house but of the weight of Evan's expectations. She walked back to her desk, pulled open a drawer, and found her journal. With a steady hand, she wrote the words that had been floating in her mind all day. "If he wants land, he can bury his decency in it." The words settled on the page as if they had always been there, waiting to be written. Helen closed the journal, feeling a small weight lift from her chest. She had made her decision, and there was no going back. The phone buzzed again, a message from Evan this time. "I need to talk to you, this has gone too far." Helen stared at the screen, feeling something shift within her. This was his final attempt, she knew, to reclaim what he thought was his, but it was too late. She wasn't interested in his apologies anymore. She turned off her phone, the quiet of the room wrapping around her like a cloak. She was done. And this time, Evan would have to reckon with the consequences of his cruelty. The warmth of the late afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow on the table where Helen and Ruth sat, tea steaming between them. The cup felt heavy in Helen's hands, more so than it should have, as if it were anchoring her to the moment. Ruth was waiting, her eyes soft and patient, as Helen stirred the liquid slowly, the spoon tapping gently against the porcelain. Finally, Helen spoke, her voice low but steady. "Evan showed up again this morning with a notary." Ruth's gaze didn't waver, but Helen could see the subtle tightening in her friend's jaw. Ruth didn't ask for details, didn't need to. She just waited, the years of friendship and shared history filling the silence. Helen let out a breath, leaning back in her chair. "I told him no, I won't make it easy for him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, but Ruth didn't flinch. Instead, she reached over, her hand resting lightly on Helen's. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly, her voice thick with understanding. Helen nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "The cabin, I've signed it over to a wildlife trust. It's mine now for as long as I live." Ruth didn't react immediately. Her expression was thoughtful, but she didn't speak for several moments, letting the weight of the decision settle into the quiet space between them. Finally, her voice came, low and deliberate. "Let's make sure you live a long time, Helen." Helen's heart stilled for a moment, the words sinking deep into her chest, filling the empty spaces left behind by years of resentment and regret. This was it. Ruth, her closest friend, was the one who would ensure that Helen was not alone. Ruth's eyes met hers, and Helen could see the resolve in them. "We'll set up a system. You'll never be alone, not now, not anymore." And so they began. Ruth started coming over every morning, bringing fresh groceries and, when needed, helping Helen navigate the complexities of her medication schedule. Audrey, ever thoughtful, always present, designed a system of labels for the pills, each one marked with a time and day. Helen found herself smiling more often, even as her health remained uncertain. For the first time in years, she was no longer fighting alone. Evan, of course, never stopped trying. He called once or twice a week, but his voice was clipped, tense, his demands for answers veiled in politeness. Each time Helen let the calls go to voicemail, she wasn't interested anymore. The damage had already been done, and she wasn't about to indulge him now. One afternoon, as Helen sat at her kitchen table sorting through some papers, the phone rang again. It was Dr. Benton this time, his voice as calm and steady as ever. Hello, Helen, I just wanted to check in. Your support network is solid, that's rare. Helen allowed herself a small smile, her heart swelling with an unexpected tenderness. The words hit her like a balm. This, the doctor's quiet recognition of the strength of the people around her, felt like the reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. The ones who had stayed, the ones who understood. As she hung up the phone, Helen looked out at the mountain peaks in the distance, a quiet certainty settling over her. The storm of her life hadn't passed yet, but it felt manageable now. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. The knock on the door came late that afternoon. It was soft, tentative at first, but as Helen opened the door, her heart didn't skip a beat. Evan stood there, his face pinched with frustration, a stack of papers in his hands. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice edged with impatience. Helen didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back, closing the door quietly in his face. She didn't need to listen anymore, not to him. Helen stood at the door of the art therapy room, her palms sweaty against the cool handle. She had never been much of an artist, at least not in the way others were. She'd always admired the work of others but never felt capable of creating anything worth showing. Yet the doctor had suggested this, art therapy, to help her process what she was going through. She hesitated for a moment, her hand on the door, the quiet murmur of voices from inside making her heart race. She wasn't sure why she was nervous. She had no reason to be, but the thought of exposing her thoughts, her grief, her loneliness through something so personal, it unsettled her. The door opened and a woman with a warm smile greeted her, ushering her inside. The room was filled with canvases and paint, soft music drifting in the background. People were scattered around the room, lost in their own work. The smell of fresh paint and turpentine mingled in the air. Helen hesitated at the threshold, scanning the room, but the group's gentle attention shifted toward her. First time, one of the women asked, smiling at her with a knowing look. Helen nodded, unsure how to explain the knot in her chest, the swirl of emotions she wasn't yet sure how to name. Don't worry, the woman said, you don't have to be an artist, just let it out. Helen was handed a canvas and a small set of brushes. She sat at an easel in the corner, her fingers trembling as she picked up the smallest brush. The woman who had greeted her started painting, filling the canvas with gentle strokes. Helen stared at the blank space in front of her. For a long moment, the brush hovered above the canvas, but her mind wandered to the home she had grown up in, to the house she had loved before it had turned into a place of unbearable silence. Finally, her hand moved, and with each stroke, memories poured out. The familiar outline of the house, the worn-down porch steps, the overgrown garden that had once been filled with life. But as she painted, something shifted inside her. The soft, nostalgic colors turned darker, more jagged. Red streaks filled the spaces where memories used to be, ripping through the house she had known, the place that had once given her security. Without thinking, her hand slammed the brush down into deep crimson and began streaking the entire canvas with bold, violent strokes. She watched as the house turned to flames, brilliant red fire consuming everything. Her mind had gone somewhere dark, somewhere raw. Her breath caught as she stepped back, staring at the swirling destruction in front of her. It was ugly, chaotic, and painful, but it was honest. The room fell silent for a moment. Then one of the women, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, walked over. I get it, she whispered. The words settled like an unexpected weight in the pit of Helen's stomach, but it wasn't a burden, it was recognition. She was understood. The days that followed felt different. Audrey had begun visiting more often, her sketchbook always tucked under her arm. She'd sit quietly at the kitchen table, sketching the shadows in the corners of the room, the light falling across the cabinets, the way Helen's hands trembled when she reached for a cup. One evening, as Helen sat in her armchair, the soft glow of the lamp spilling across the room, her phone buzzed. It was a post from Evan, accompanied by a picture of him and Claire both smiling at a dinner table. His caption read, "Family time with our strongest generation red." Helen stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She scrolled slowly, absorbing the image the way they looked, so perfect, so untouched by everything that had happened between them. She didn't know why, but something inside her snapped. She took a screenshot of the photo and printed it, the image small and crisp on the paper. Then she walked to the kitchen, pinned it under her fridge magnet, and stared at it. Fiction, she wrote under it in bold, black letters. The word felt like a declaration. He had made his choice, and so had she. and now it was time to rewrite her own story without him. The real estate office was bright, sterile, and unimpressive, just like everything else Evan had ever touched. Helen walked in slowly, her steps deliberate as she crossed the lobby, the faint hum of overhead lights a reminder of just how little room she had left for distractions. The receptionist looked up briefly, offering a half-smile that quickly faltered when she saw Helen's expression. "I need to speak with someone about a listing," Helen said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made the receptionist hesitate. "Of course, ma'am, right this way." Helen followed the receptionist down a narrow hallway to an office tucked at the back of the building. Inside, a man in his late 50s looked up from a pile of paperwork. He was stocky, with thick glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His eyes flickered briefly over Helen, then back to the papers in front of him. She could already sense his desire to get this over with, but she wasn't in the mood to make things easy. "Hello," she said, pulling a seat out from under the desk and sitting across from him. "I'm Helen Moore. I'm here to discuss a property listing." He blinked at her, eyes narrowing. "Okay, are you looking to buy or sell?" "No," Helen replied, her gaze unwavering. "I'm here to file a formal complaint. My son Evan Moore listed my house under pending inheritance." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unyielding. The agent paused, then cleared his throat. "I see, and you're the owner." "I am," she said, her voice steady, "and I never gave him permission to list it." The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pulling up the computer screen to check. His fingers clacked over the keys, and after a few moments he looked back at her, now concerned. "It looks like it's been posted. Pending inheritance, just as you said," he murmured, then added after a beat, "This is very serious, ma'am, if your son is." Helen cut him off, her voice sharp. "I'm aware. I'm also aware that he's abusing his position, trying to profit off of my illness before I'm even gone." The man's face softened slightly. He glanced at the screen again. "I'll take care of it. We can flag the listing for review, and I'll make sure there are no further actions taken until this is resolved." Helen didn't move. She remained seated, her fingers resting on the edge of the desk, her eyes hard. "That's not good enough. I want this listing erased. I want his license flagged for review. I want it on the record." E-man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'll do that right away," he muttered, typing rapidly on his keyboard. The tension in the room thickened, as if everyone knew exactly what was at stake, even if the agent was only a bystander to it. That afternoon, the phone rang as Helen sat at her kitchen table, sorting through bills she no longer cared about. She didn't even need to look at the screen before she knew who it was. It was Claire. He's just under pressure, Helen," Claire's voice trembled. "He didn't mean to." Helen's hand tightened around the phone, the grip almost painful. "So was Cole," she interrupted, her voice cold and unwavering. "That's why it became Diamond. Your husband, he became dust." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Helen didn't regret her words. "I'll make sure this gets handled," she said, cutting off the call before Claire could respond. Later that evening, Helen sat at the kitchen table, the silence thick in the air. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this resolute, this unshakable. The listing had disappeared, so had Evan for now. She allowed herself a small, quiet smile as the weight of the decision settled over her. Evan hadn't seen her as a person for years, only as a means to an end. Now, for the first time in decades, Helen Moore was no one's asset, not his, not anyone's. And she wasn't done yet. The phone rang early, its insistent buzz cutting through the silence of the house. Helen's hand hovered over the receiver for a moment before she answered. The screen read Dr. Benton. "Good morning, Helen," his voice was calm, familiar, reassuring. "I have your updated scans here." Helen's heart skipped a beat, her grip tightening around the phone. She didn't know what she was expecting, but it wasn't the calm certainty in Dr. Benton's tone. The uncertainty of her condition had loomed over her for months, a shadow she couldn't escape. Now, after all the doctor visits, the tests, the endless waiting, she wondered what this phone call might change. "I've got good news," Dr. Benton continued, his words measured, as if carefully choosing each one. "Your condition has stabilized. The progression has slowed significantly, Helen, unexpectedly." She sat back in her chair, her breath catching in her throat. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the news had forced everything around her to shift. She could hardly breathe for a moment, the weight of the words stable hanging in the air. Dr. Benton's voice softened like a balm against the rapid pulse in her ears. I've seen people live decades with this pace, Helen. This isn't what we expected, but it's certainly a better scenario than we feared. The words blurred together for a moment, her mind struggling to absorb the reality. Stable. The word felt foreign. It didn't match the illness, the fears she had been carrying for so long. She had prepared herself for the inevitable, for the slow decline. But now, with her life stretching out ahead of her, she didn't know what to do with this new reality. Thank you was all she could manage, her voice barely above a whisper. Just take care of yourself, Dr. Benton said. We'll monitor you closely, of course, but there's no need to make any drastic changes. You're doing well. Helen set the phone down gently, her fingers still trembling. She couldn't explain it, how the news filled her with relief and dread at the same time. She wasn't sure what the future held, but it was no longer the quiet, predictable end she had imagined. It was a new uncertainty, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Later that afternoon, Evan showed up at Ruth's house, standing at her doorstep with a look of barely contained frustration on his face. Ruth opened the door, her expression unreadable, but she didn't invite him inside. She had learned long ago not to make it easy for him. How bad has it gotten? Evan's voice was clipped, his gaze darting around the yard as if searching for something in the quiet surroundings. Ruth didn't answer immediately. She knew exactly what he was after: information, control, but she wasn't about to give him any satisfaction. She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. Helen's doing fine, she finally said, her voice steady. Better than expected. Evan's eyes flickered. But how bad? What's the prognosis, Ruth? I'm not the one who should be giving you updates, she replied, her tone firm, as if daring him to challenge her. Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't press further. With a muttered thanks, he turned and walked away, his shoulders stiff as he retreated down the path. That evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table, her fingers hovering over her phone. The voicemail from Claire had arrived hours ago. She listened again, Claire's voice soft and pleading. You should consider full-time care, Helen. Evan can manage the estate. It's just too much for you right now. Let him help. Helen let out a short laugh, more out of disbelief than humor. She'd heard enough of Evan's help. She didn't need him managing anything, let alone her life. She typed her response, her fingers moving with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The only thing he'll manage is regret. She hit send without a second thought, feeling a strange satisfaction in the finality of the words. As night fell, Helen was cleaning up the kitchen when she heard the sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, like someone trying to stay unnoticed. She moved to the window, peering through the curtains, her heart suddenly racing. There he was, Evan, pacing outside her house just out of sight of the street lamp, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Helen's breath caught in her throat. He didn't know she was watching, but Audrey did. Audrey stepped into the room, her phone held tight in her hand. I recorded him, she said quietly, her voice just above a whisper. She looked up at Helen, her eyes wide with concern. What should we do with it? Helen's gaze stayed fixed on Evan's figure in the dark, his silhouette sharp against the dim streetlight. The thought of him pacing outside, trying to control the narrative once more, filled her with a calm fury. Let him wonder, Helen replied, her voice steady and cold. For now, let him wonder. The news traveled fast, as it always did in a small town like Asheville. Helen heard it from Ruth first, over a cup of tea that afternoon. Evan's been reducing his hours at work, Ruth said, the news almost casual as she stirred her tea. They're recommending he cut back on the stress. He's under a lot of pressure, apparently. Helen didn't respond immediately, the words swirling in her mind. Evan, who had always prided himself on his control, his tight grip on everything around him, was now being told to manage his stress. She felt a strange, almost involuntary satisfaction. It wasn't a feeling she had expected, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. Later that evening, a note arrived. It was handwritten, the familiar tight scrawl that Helen had seen countless times before. She unfolded the paper, the words hitting her in a way she wasn't prepared for. Happy. The note was simple, blunt, but it carried an undercurrent of frustration, of challenge. Evan had been trying to force the narrative on his terms, but now this was his way of reaching out. He didn't get to dictate how things went anymore. Helen set the note down without replying, her hands calm despite the storm of emotions inside her. She wasn't angry, but neither was she moved. He wanted to play games, to manipulate, but she was done. The next day, Claire showed up at the front door. She was alone. Her posture was tense, her face drawn and pale, as if something had shifted between her and Evan. "Helen, I'm sorry," Claire said, her voice soft, hesitant. She stepped forward into the house but didn't make eye contact. "He's not well, he's been struggling." Helen leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, waiting for the apology or the explanation. There was no warmth in her gaze, no forgiveness in her tone. "Neither was his soul when he was healthy," Helen replied, her words sharp but controlled. Claire flinched at the remark but didn't say anything in return. Instead, she looked down, a quiet acceptance in her eyes. She could see the wall Helen had built, the one that was now unbreakable. Helen wasn't offering solace, she had no more patience for it. A few days later, Audrey arrived at Helen's house, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, a determined look on her face. She had been spending more time with her grandmother recently, the girl's quiet wisdom beyond her years. Audrey had begun documenting Helen's daily routine, sketching her in the garden, at the kitchen table, walking through the yard with Ruth. "You're beating what was meant to beat you," Audrey said one evening, her pencil moving over the paper as she captured Helen's image. Helen looked up from her book, meeting Audrey's gaze. "I suppose I am." Audrey nodded, her eyes warm with something that could only be described as quiet pride. The girl had seen it all, the struggle, the betrayal, the strength. She understood in a way that no one else did, even if she didn't have the words for it. Helen smiled faintly and turned back to her book, the weight of her thoughts lighter in the company of Audrey. They had become a kind of family, the two of them, no pretensions, no demands. Later that evening, Helen found herself sitting at her desk, the quiet house surrounding her like a cocoon. She picked up the phone, dialing Dr. Benton's number. When he picked up, his voice was warm, familiar, a steadying force that she had grown to rely on. "Helen, how are you doing?" Helen leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the fading light. She took a long breath, letting the silence settle around her before speaking. "Is it petty to feel relief?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Dr. Benton replied, his voice was gentle. "No, Helen, it's human." She let his words sink in, the weight of them settling over her like a blanket. She wasn't wrong to feel this way. She wasn't wrong to feel relief when Evan, who had once controlled so much of her life, now had to deal with his own unraveling. As she hung up the phone, Helen glanced out the window once more. The sun was dipping below the horizon, the darkening sky reminding her that there was still time for what, she wasn't sure yet, but the future was no longer something she feared. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The courtroom was cold, sterile, like everything else that had been decided for Helen in the last few months. The judge, a middle-aged man with sharp glasses and a sharp suit, sat behind his bench, flipping through papers without looking up. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paperwork. Helen, Ruth, and Dr. Benton sat together at one of the long wooden tables, their presence a quiet force in the midst of the chaos that had been Evan's attempt to wrest control from her. Across the room, Evan sat with Claire, both of them hunched forward in their seats, their eyes cast downward as though trying to avoid the reality of the moment. Evan hadn't spoken to her since the last time they saw each other. And now here they were, facing the judgment of someone who had no investment in their drama. Helen's hands were steady as she set down the thick stack of papers in front of her. She glanced at Ruth, who gave her a small nod, the kind of silent reassurance only a lifelong friend could offer. "Ms. Moore," the judge began, looking up briefly from his notes, his voice measured, "please present your evidence." Helen stood slowly, her legs steady despite the weight pressing on her chest. She opened the binder in front of her and began to speak, her voice calm and clear. "I've kept detailed records, Your Honor, every journal entry, every medication log, every note from Dr. Benton. These are the facts. I'm still here. I'm still in control of my life." She placed each document carefully in front of the judge, watching as he flipped through the pages. Ruth sat next to her, her hand resting on the table, and Dr. Benton's presence beside them was a steady reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Dr. Benton spoke next, his voice firm and unyielding. "I've been treating Helen for the past several months, Your Honor. I can confirm that she is more competent than most of my healthy patients. Her condition has not impaired her ability to make decisions. She's sharp, clear-headed, and fully aware of what she's doing." Helen felt a quiet surge of pride, not for herself, but for the way she had managed to keep control of her life amidst all the chaos. This was the moment she had waited for, when she would finally be heard, when she would be seen as the competent, capable person she knew herself to be. Ruth's voice, though quieter, was no less strong. "She's just finally sick of being used," Ruth added, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "For years, Evan treated her as an asset, something to be managed and manipulated, but she's done with that." Helen didn't look at Evan or Claire, she couldn't. Instead, she kept her focus straight ahead, on the judge, on the truth. She had nothing left to prove. The courtroom was tense with silence, the weight of the words hanging in the air. Claire sat in the back, her eyes downcast, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Evan, too, avoided looking at Helen, his gaze fixed on the floor. His shoulders were hunched, as if the weight of everything he had tried to do was too much to bear. The judge cleared his throat and looked down at his notes, then back up at Helen. "Based on the evidence presented, I see no grounds to question Ms. Moore's decisions. The case is closed." Helen felt something break inside her, something heavy, something that had been weighing her down for years. The finality of the words didn't feel like a victory, it felt like release. As she sat back down, Ruth's hand found hers, squeezing gently, a silent promise that they had won. There were no more battles to fight, no more games to be played. The courtroom, once a place of tension and fear, now felt like the first step into a future where Helen was in control. Helen didn't look at Evan as they left the room. She didn't need to. He had made his choices, and now he would have to live with them. And as she stepped into the hallway, the weight of the finality of the ruling settled over her like a soft, familiar blanket. Helen sat in the stillness of her apartment, the morning sun spilling through the blinds, casting delicate lines of light across the room. The city outside was already waking up, cars moving in steady lines, people rushing to places, to lives that were moving forward. She, too, was moving forward, but it didn't always feel like it. There were moments when the past would catch her off guard, as it had today. Her fingers brushed the top of the old shoebox tucked in the corner of her closet, the one she hadn't opened in years. It was buried beneath piles of scarves and old letters, and yet it had always been there, waiting for her to remember. Slowly, almost against her will, she pulled it out. Her heart skipped when she saw the envelope sitting on top. It was addressed to Evan, written in her younger, more hopeful hand. It had been 10 years since she'd written it. 10 years since she had believed, truly believed, that there was something worth saving in him. Helen stared at the envelope for a long moment. She hadn't meant to find it, not today, not now, but somehow she'd reached for it. She opened it slowly, as if bracing herself for what was inside. The letter was old, the ink faded in places but still legible. She began to read, her throat tightening with every word. It was filled with forgiveness, more forgiveness than she had ever thought herself capable of. It was filled with hope, with a belief in the possibility of redemption, in the idea that the man she once knew could still show up, could still find his way back. She had written about their future, one where they could heal together, where they could be the people they had always promised each other they would be. "I still believe in you, Evan, even after everything. I believe that you can change. I believe that we can make this work." Her hand trembled as she read those words. How naive she had been. How desperately she had wanted to believe in him, to believe in the version of him she had constructed in her mind, the man who could still be saved. Helen's chest tightened, and without thinking she ripped the letter in half, the sound of the paper tearing filling the silence around her. She didn't rip it out of anger, not anymore. She had already let go of the anger long ago. No, this was something different. This was clarity. The person she had written to, the person she had hoped Evan would become, had never shown up. He never would. She stood and walked to the trash can, tossing the torn pieces inside, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders as she did. The finality of the action wasn't painful. It wasn't a loss. It was release. It was a decision made, a chapter closed. She wasn't angry. She was just done. Later, as the afternoon light began to fade, Helen sat down at her kitchen table, where a stack of papers and scattered sketches lay before her. She had been thinking about it for weeks, months, even about doing something that felt entirely hers, something that she could shape without anyone else's influence. A community art show, a small one but one with meaning. She would invite only the people who truly mattered, those who had been there for her without question. It would be intimate. It would be her world, her creation. Ruth was the first person she called. She hadn't even finished explaining the idea before Ruth was already in. "I'm in, whatever you need," Ruth said. Her voice was warm, steady, just like Ruth always was. Helen smiled. She didn't have to explain anything else. Ruth would be there, and then there was Audrey. She thought about the pieces Audrey might contribute, each one a silent story told through color and form. She could already see it in her mind, Audrey's painting of a grandmother, roots growing from her feet deep into the earth, strong, silent, enduring, just like Audrey. The evening felt different, lighter. It felt like the world was opening up for her, like the air was just a little bit easier to breathe. She was making something new, something that didn't have to be defined by Evan, by the past, by any of it. She was creating, for the first time, something that was entirely her own. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet. It was Ruth. "Helen," Ruth's voice came through, tight with urgency. "I just found out something about Evan." Helen's heart dropped, the weight of the world crashing down on her once more. The roots of her peace, which had just started to settle, now felt as if they were beginning to tremble. Helen sat at her desk, her pen poised over the final page of the trust document. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, but her hand was steady. She had spent months contemplating this moment, planning with care. It was time to make it official. Ruth, Audrey, and a local arts nonprofit would be her legacy. This was the family she had chosen, those who had stood by her through every storm, who had seen her when she was invisible to everyone else. They were the ones who had earned their place in her life, in her heart. Her house, the one where so much had been broken and rebuilt, would be transformed. It would become an art retreat for older women in transition, a place where they could find themselves again just as she had. The thought of it brought a quiet smile to her face. It felt like the perfect way to give back, to offer others what she had learned, that it was never too late to start over. The last part of the document was the hardest, but it had to be done. She looked at Evan's name written in cold ink and added the clause, excluded by sustained emotional negligence. There was no room left for him in her future, no more space for the person he had refused to become. She signed the document and set the pen down, feeling the weight of it lift from her shoulders. It wasn't just a legal formality, it was a declaration. She was done. Her phone buzzed and Ruth's name appeared on the screen. Helen answered with a quiet smile. "Ruth, it's done," Helen said, her voice calm but thick with emotion. "I've made my decision." There was a long pause on the other end, then Ruth's voice came through, warm but filled with a tremor of something deeper. I just read it, Helen. I'm speechless. I'm honored. You've given us so much." Helen felt a pang of something, relief, gratitude, but also the undeniable truth that Ruth had always been there, unwavering. "You've always been there for me, Ruth. It's the least I could do." Later that evening, Audrey arrived, her face already wet with tears when she saw the trust papers in Helen's hands. She knew something had changed, something big. "I swear, Helen," Audrey whispered, her voice trembling, "I'll take care of it. I'll take care of everything you've built." Helen nodded, the ache in her chest softer now. Audrey's words meant everything. They weren't just promises, they were truths she could hold on to as she passed this part of her life on. Audrey had always understood her in a way no one else had. She would honor the house, the retreat, and everything it stood for. The evening shifted into the opening of the gallery show. Dr. Benton stood beside her, raising his glass. The gallery, full of people, hummed with energy as art filled the walls. "To Helen," Dr. Benton said, his voice warm, not gone, but finally seen. The crowd clapped, but Helen only smiled, her eyes meeting his. She hadn't expected to hear those words tonight, but they hit her like a wave. Finally seen, it was a gift she didn't know she'd been waiting for. As the evening settled into quiet conversations and soft laughter, a final message appeared on her phone. It was from Claire. "I hope someday he sees what he lost." Helen read the words, her heart tightening briefly. But then just as quickly she set the phone down. She didn't need to respond, she didn't need to prove anything. She had made her choice, built her family, and created something meaningful for the first time in years. The past, the lost potential, the broken promises, it was all fading away now, and she was finally free. As the night stretched on, Helen stood surrounded by people who loved her, who truly saw her. It was a quiet moment, but it was everything. Helen stood in front of the canvas, her brush hovering in the quiet room, the early morning light spilling through the windows. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the wind outside and the distant call of birds. She had spent weeks thinking about this last piece, the one that would complete everything: her art, her journey, her release. She dipped the brush in muted earth tones, the colors mixing with a quiet purpose. Slowly, she began to paint. A mountain rose on the canvas, stark and silent. No path climbed it, no trail marked the way. The surface was solid, unyielding, an immovable thing, and at its base, roots stretched outward, curling into the soil, deep and connected to something ancient. There was no summit to reach, no destination to be found, only the roots, only the earth. She stepped back, studying it. There was no need for more detail, no need for a resolution. It was enough. She titled it Unreachable. The piece found its place in the retreat's front hallway, where Audrey carefully hung it, the roots sprawling out across the canvas like the foundation of everything that had come before. It felt like the last thread in a tapestry that had taken years to weave. Helen's days slowed, each one unfolding in a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. She spent hours in the garden, her hands in the soil, planting things that would take years to grow. Ruth visited often, bringing coffee and sketchbooks. They would sit together at the kitchen table, the quiet of their shared time broken only by the scratch of pencils on paper or the soft sound of a song playing in the background. The local papers ran a feature, "Retired Teacher Builds Legacy of Peace in Paint." The headline felt strange to her, almost unreal. The article spoke of a woman who had created something for others, a safe space, a retreat, but it didn't feel like her story anymore. It felt like a chapter she was already walking away from, a book she had closed. Her final check went to fund a scholarship for survivors of family silence. It was a simple gesture, but one that meant everything. She had been that survivor. She knew the cost of silence. She wanted others to find their voice, their freedom. Dr. Benton came by one afternoon for coffee, just as he had done many times before. He had stopped asking if she was doing okay, knowing now that the answer was always the same. Instead, they sat together in the kitchen, the warm mugs between them, both understanding the silence that filled the space. He looked at her with quiet respect, his gaze steady and knowing. There were no words needed. Helen sipped her coffee, feeling something shift again, something deeper. There was no more anger, no more need for explanation. Everything she had built was solid, and she could feel the roots of her peace growing deeper with each passing day. But there was still the faintest tug in her chest, a question that had never fully released its grip. And then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed softly on the table. She didn't need to look at it to know who it was. "Evan." The message, brief and to the point. "I've been thinking about you." Helen set the phone down without reading further, her heart beating just a little faster than it had in years. The retreat's first official opening was a quiet affair, filled with people who had seen the seeds of it grow. The air was crisp with late autumn, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the earthy perfume of the garden outside. Helen sat beside Ruth, a small smile tugging at her lips, her notebook resting in her lap. The weight of everything she had built was present, but it didn't feel heavy, not anymore. It felt like peace, the kind of peace that had taken root in every corner of this house, in every breath she had taken since the decision had been made. Audrey stood at the front, her voice strong as she addressed the room. The words came easily to her, but they held a weight that Helen could feel all the way in the back. "My grandmother taught me that survival is louder than silence," Audrey said, her eyes scanning the room, steady and sure. "And this place, this retreat, is where we learn that our voices matter, that we are worthy of space. To Helen, who gave us that space, thank you." The applause that followed was soft but sincere, a ripple of gratitude in the room. Helen's heart swelled as she looked at Audrey, so full of grace, so full of life. This place was everything they had dreamed of. It was where people could heal, create, find peace. Dr. Benton arrived a little later, his familiar face lighting up the room with his quiet energy. He approached Helen and Ruth with a broad smile, holding an envelope in his hands. "I have some news for you, Helen," he said, sitting down across from them. "Your story is being included in a national health equity campaign. They want to highlight your work, your life, everything you've done to build this legacy." Helen blinked, surprised at first, but then a slow smile spread across her face. It felt fitting, though, in a way she hadn't expected. Her life, her story, her truth was now a part of something larger than herself. Later that evening, as the light began to fade, Helen sat alone in her room, her journal open on her lap. She had been writing for days, reflecting on everything that had come before and everything that was yet to come. She added one last page to the journal. He said I wasn't dying Foz. Enough, I chose to live slower and better. She set the pen down, the words settling on the page like a soft exhale. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to explain. She had chosen to live on her terms, at her pace. She wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. Through the window, she looked at the trees. They were bare now, their branches reaching toward the sky, strong and resilient. She wasn't waiting for anyone, not Evan, not the past, not anything. The world was hers to shape now, to fill with the colors and the silence she had learned to embrace. A few days later, she received word that her painting Unreachable had been purchased by a museum. The proceeds would fund Audrey's college tuition, an honor Helen could never have imagined when she first put brush to canvas. As the sun set, Helen stood by the window, the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders. The message from her son, the one that had haunted her for so long, echoed in her mind, "You're not dying fast enough." She let out a breath, the quiet strength of the moment settling into her bones. My son once said I wasn't dying fast enough, but I didn't die. I just left from his world, from his reach, and from every part of me he thought he owned. And with that, she felt something inside her finally break free.